You're listening to a podcast of The Mojo with Steph Renee. Weekdays 10 a.m. till noon on 900 AM WURD.com.
Blaxploitation films, of course, gave us an opportunity to really sort of connect the Black music culture that was so prevalent during that time in the late 60s and early 70s with the imagery that was coming up at that time, which is incredibly important as well. This notion of being able to embrace the way that we're presenting ourselves to the world. You know, I mean, I've been busy this week with Beyonce and all of the information that has been circulating around the internet in terms of people's reaction to her Formation video and the unapologetically Black imagery that exists within that context. And I think the same thing about Blaxploitation films. Like, I'm just young enough where my parents weren't going to let me watch some of these films that we're going to be discussing with our next guest when they were out in real time. And even as I was growing up, this wasn't going to be something that they were going to encourage me to seek out because of the imagery that's included. But at the same time, these are building blocks to what we understand as Black culture.
Absolutely. And it's our guest is on the line now. So Gerald R. Butters, Professor Butters, is a professor of history at Aurora University. His research and publications examine the intersection of race and gender in American popular culture. His books include Banned in Kansas, Motion Picture Censorship, 1915 to 1966, and Black Manhood on the Silent Screen. A Fulbright scholar, Butters has lectured internationally, including an address to the European Commission in Luxembourg in 2009.
And today we're going to talk about Blaxploitation male imagery in his new book.
His brand new book is called From Sweetback to Superfly, Race in Films, Audiences in Chicago's Loop. So with us on the line is Professor Gerald R. Butters, Jr. Hey.
Yes. Good morning, Professor Butters. Welcome to WURD.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on today. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So I love the book. I mean, I'm obviously a big Blaxploitation movie fan, but what I really appreciate about this book is that you put the history of Blaxploitation in a framework that I never really thought about, by specifically looking at a microcosm where these films thrived. Can you let people know about the book From Sweetback to Superfly?
Yeah, Mike, when I originally started this book, we moved to Chicago in 1999, and I began to realize there were over a dozen huge movie theaters in the Loop in the 1960s and 1970s, and some of them had 3,000, 4,000 seats.
Wow.
And I wondered what happened to all of them, because none of them showed movies when we moved there in 1999. So I decided to write a history about the fate of these theaters, and I had no idea when I began researching it that it was all about race. That was the key to the entire book, and I had no understanding that was where this research was going to take me.
Well, I want to jump in and ask, when we think about our major metropolitan areas in the United States, I think the phenomenon that you're speaking about with these palatial movie theaters is something that people lament the loss of here in Philadelphia as well. So I think there'll be a lot of kind of empathy for the tales that you tell here about how going to the movies was, the social scene. And to put that in the context of being able to see powerful images of Black winning on a lot of different levels on the screen in a theater of this size with so many people from your surrounding community cheering on at the screen, it had to be, something to kind of look back at those images and kind of reconstruct this in your head as you're writing the book.
The one thing that I got to do was to interview a lot of people who were alive during that time and who remembered not only attending these theaters during the Blaxploitation era, but also what it was like in the 1940s and 1950s. The Loop in downtown Chicago was not a place that was necessarily nice to African American people during that time. And so one of the things I argue is that, going to a Blaxploitation movie in the early 1970s was really a political act, because in some ways it was a continuation of the civil rights movement, because African American people were not necessarily wanted in the Loop prior to the 1970s. And in a way, when you've got thousands of young African American people, mostly teenagers in the early 20s, going to a movie theater to go see Shaft or go see Superfly, it's a way of saying this is our space too.
Yeah.
This is our community too.
And, Philadelphia is considered the city of neighborhoods. There is a set of geography. And even one of our daily on-air personalities, Reverend Nick Taliaferro, talks about growing up in this city and feeling that there were neighborhoods where he wasn't welcome, where he was chased out of. And Chicago has a very similar history with that, as you just mentioned. Of course, I know about the South Side being the place where, Black people were expected to kind of grow up and live. And so this idea of the loop is the equivalent of really being smack dab in the middle of where the areas that are being most gentrified in most major metropolitan areas now, correct?
Exactly. And this is just a microcosm of what was happening all across this country. I grew up in Kansas City, and there was the very same thing. Mm-hmm. So it's there's a pattern that's definitely there.
Yeah, I was going to say, and here in Philadelphia, and part of I guess the secret story behind Blaxploitation is that the movie industry was in trouble, and the suburban theaters hadn't really started to evolve yet. But there was this phenomenon of white flight from places like the Loop, from places like Center City in Philadelphia.
And that was one of the things that I found was unusual, is that you would have movie theaters that would literally be across the street from each other in the early 1970s. Mm-hmm. One of them would show Blaxploitation films and be considered a theater that catered to African American audiences, and the one right across the street wouldn't, and would have a predominantly white, sometimes a mixed audience. And I thought that phenomenon was so strange. And so one of the things I wanted to explore was, which came first? Did African American themed movies come first, or did African American audiences come first? So
the chicken or egg. And your conclusion?
It was a mixture of both. For example, the first theater that really I believe that African American audiences started to come in large numbers to was the Roosevelt Theater. And at first I thought, well, maybe it was the types of movies that were showed, but then I also found out that the Roosevelt was one of the few theaters that would actually hire African American people.
Oh.
So Black people are going to theaters where they can work out.
Yeah.
And that was an issue also.
A level of economic empowerment. This is great stuff. We have to take a commercial break, but we want you to hang on the line, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about what we can learn from this period in history in Chicago's film industry, and how that applies these days when we talk about who's going to the theaters to see what, and the spaces where we dwell. We're talking with Professor Gerald Butters about his new book, From Sweetback to Superfly, Race and Film Audiences in Chicago's Loop. And we'll continue with more Real Black Radio here on 900 AM WURD in just a moment. From a compilation called James Brown's Funky People, that's a little taste of the JBs with Gimme Some Mo.
Maceo.
Absolutely. And also giving us, some of the soundtrack of this period that we are discussing with our current guest. So,
Definitely.
Mike, please feel free to bring him back into the conversation.
We're speaking with Professor Gerald R. Butters. Geez, I'm sorry, Gerald. Gerald R. Butters Jr., who's the author of From Sweetback to Superfly, Black Race and Film Audiences in Chicago's Loop. And, I got a text from the professor, Charles Woods. He was just curious, what are your thoughts on the whole Blaxploitation term? I know you go into great detail in the chapters, but...
Well, I don't like the term. In fact, actually, Novotny Lawrence and I, who is at Southern Illinois University, we've got a book coming out about this later in this year. We interrogate the term because what happens is almost any movie with African American people in the 1970s gets thrown into that category. Mm-hmm. Sounder was not a Blaxploitation film.
Not at all.
Lady Sings the Blues was not a Blaxploitation film. And so it's a very problematic term. And some of those movies were very politically astute, and others were, just to try to make a buck. And so it's not a great term to use, I think.
Right, but one thing that the book does do is draw the correlation between the exploitation and the types of films that were being made. So, it was interesting to me that you go back as far as, I guess, For Love of Ivy, to show that opened the door in terms of proving that there were audiences to see this type of work.
Absolutely. I mean, there were, and that's one of the things that a lot of the distributors began to realize in the late 1960s was that African Americans were often underrepresented when it came to images on the screen, but overrepresented when it came to actually seats in the audience. And so that's when they began to look at the box office. I mean, they were in desperate straits back then. They were looking at trying to appeal to any group of people that they possibly could.
Yeah. I want to jump in, because we've talked about this music, the JBs kind of being part of the soundtrack of this era of our American lives. And I haven't had the pleasure of reading your book yet, Professor Butters, but I wonder, as you talk about the atmosphere in these theaters, the political and economic realities that funded this time and how that factored in, one of the things that resurfaced with the passing of Maurice White is in Earth, Wind and Fire doing the soundtrack for Sweetback, that there was also this sort of, atmosphere in the lobby of the theater. So people are energized by seeing these films. And then in Earth, Wind and Fire, we're traveling with the film to various places, selling the soundtrack almost like out of the trunk of their car in the lobbies of these theaters. So it was about more than just actually butt in a chair watching something on the screen. There was a lot happening in these movie houses.
No, and that's something I think that was really different from a lot of maybe white mainstream films and black themed films of this era, is you'd have Pam Grier who'd show up to the opening of a film in Chicago. You'd have producers, the directors, the stars, album giveaways were a part of it, free posters were a part of it. So those people who were behind the scenes, who were actually making the movie, were also in these theater lobbies actually meeting the potential moviegoers.
Right, and it was only like $1.25 to see these things, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right. So,
frankly, in a number of these movies, the soundtrack was better than the movie itself.
Well, I'm a big fan of it from that perspective. I'm telling you, my familiarity with Curtis Mayfield, of course, is in conjunction with a film like Superfly. And, what was going on the screen, I saw later. I could appreciate it, but the music to me is timeless.
Sergio Mims and I showed Slaughter's Big Ripoff at the Black Cinema House on Sunday, and it was the first time I really listened. James Brown did the soundtrack, and that soundtrack's amazing.
Yeah. No, he's got. Did they tell the story how he delivered the music? And they said the cues are too long, and then he's like, "Well, just cut them." He's like. He's like, I'm not going to go back and score the movie. I'm just giving you a bunch of music to throw in there. So, but so it was like a 5 or 6 year stretch where black films were really taking off. But there's a lot of debate as to why it ended. I mean, from your perspective in telling the story in the book, what curtailed the growth of black film and the black film industry back in the 70s?
Well, this sounds very conspiracy theory oriented, but it really isn't. I have the documentation to prove it. When there started to be thousands of young African American people in the loop in 1972, 1973, it scared the hell out of the white business establishment. And they began working with the Richard J. Daley administration to try to find ways to eventually close up a number of these theaters. And so what happened in 1973, 1974 is a consortium of business people began buying up the theaters with the idea that they'd eventually be condemned under eminent domain. So they didn't put a dollar into them. I mean, the theaters back then, they were 40, 50 years old. They were falling on some hard times. So the one thing that all the people talked about, who I interviewed, who actually went to these theaters, is they talked about putting their feet up on the seats in front of them because the rats were scurrying around on the floors. They did not get bit. And so where many people argue that historians will argue there was an oversaturation of the market, I'm going to also argue that the theaters, if you don't have theaters to show these movies, then the movies aren't going to exist. The movies can't be distributed.
Hearing stories like that, it's not the first time I've heard it, but every time I hear it, it breaks my heart all over again. The idea that these were spaces where people could take a moment to escape the political realities that surrounded them, and again, cheer for the hero on the screen, or cheer for a story about overcoming. And, as you've just described, the political realities of having people gathered for that kind of purpose also led ultimately to taking away those spaces where they had that escape.
Exactly, because the neighborhood theaters were also being closed in the early 1970s. So there were those spaces simply were not there. And I don't think this issue's necessarily gone away. When I was in the middle of writing this book, it must have been about 5 years ago in Kansas City, there's an upscale area called the Plaza, and during the summer there started to be hundreds of young African-American youth who would go to the movies down then. Suddenly, the movie chain decided that on the weekends you had to be 18 and over to go to a movie by yourself. I mean, there's an attempt to try to, economically and racially discriminate there.
Yeah.
So these issues haven't gone away.
Right, and then also things became a little more mainstream in the 70s. Like you point out that The Exorcist was a huge hit across the board. Blacks and whites all wanted to go see certain types of movies.
Exactly, and that, I think that's one of the things that the distributors were not very wise about. They assumed that African American audiences only wanted to see movies with African American people in them. Well, they knew that The Godfather, over half the audience for The Godfather in Chicago was African American. The Exorcist had a huge black presence in the audience. Clint Eastwood was very aware of this. He knew that he was a draw for African American audiences in the early 1970s. So the decisions they sometimes made on programming were not the smartest ones.
But meticulously researched. I mean, I was very familiar in the role of kung fu films, of course, in terms of black audiences in the 70s and the theaters. But I mean, I just had a blast reading the book just because I could see you did the research. Like, not only does Gerald tell you about the films, but talks about how big a hit each was, what the box office grosses were, and how big a hit Spook Who Sat by the Door was.
Yes, with the late Sam Greenlee. So with all of the work that you've put into this particular book, I know you said that you have another one in the works. Can you make sure that people in our listening audience know how to follow you, your research, and support your publications?
Absolutely. I've got a website, GeraldButters.com. So
that's easy.
It is.
And it rolls off your tongue better.
Yes, indeed. Well, we're almost out of time, but we certainly appreciate you making time to join us today and draw this mental picture for us, with all of the conversation we've been having about the Oscar ceremony and the controversy swirling around that, having some historical context for how we need to preserve the idea of everybody being welcomed into an entertainment space to see reflections of themselves on the screen, and the fight that is still ongoing to make sure that happens is wonderfully encapsulated in the research you've been able to bring us. And we thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you having me on.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, that is Professor Gerald Butters. Again, the name of his book is From Sweetback to Superfly, Race and Film Audiences in Chicago's Loop. If you go to GeraldButters.com, you can get all the information about this book and the other work that he has coming out, and just, give us a slice of history that we need to remember, that we need to learn about, and that we need to share.